Warlike, yet wants to avoid war. Donald Trump says to be open to diplomacy and wants talks with Iran. This after US forces were about to strike 3 different Iranian sites in retaliation for the downing of an American drone. Still not scrapped, the extradition bill might have to come to a halt, has come to a halt, but the protests will continue until it's entirely out. Activists have called for an investigation into alleged police brutality. And following the outbreak of unrest in Georgia, prompting the head of parliament to step down, Russia's president orders the suspension of passenger flights to and fro and recommends all travel agencies to suspend all tours. Hello, welcome back to the France 24 newsroom. It was minutes away before the US forces were on the verge of striking Iran in retaliation for the downing of an American drone. It was engaged over the Gulf of Oman, and despite 2 warnings from the Revolutionary Guards, the surveillance aircraft was shot down. In a combative tone, Donald Trump tweeted that 3 Iranian sites were targeted, but he put a stop to the mission, avoiding the death of 150 people. This latest spat comes after Washington accused Iran of carrying out attacks on oil tankers last week. The US now requests a UN Security Council meeting on Iran this Monday. Ellen Gainsford has the story.
He claims he showed restraint. A day after calling off retaliatory airstrikes on Iran for shooting down an American drone, Donald Trump has explained his decision, saying he was concerned for civilian lives.
I thought about it for a second. I said, you know what? They shot down an unmanned drone, plane, whatever you want to call it. And here we are sitting with 150 dead people. That would have taken place probably within a half an hour after I said go ahead. Yeah. And I didn't like it. I didn't think it was proportionate.
Washington insists a drone, similar to the one pictured here, was in international airspace over the Strait of Hormuz at the time it was shot down. But Iran says the drone violated its airspace and was justifiably targeted at the location shown by the Revolutionary Guard. Tehran released this footage on Friday of debris it says it pulled from its territorial water and claimed it too had exercised restraint by targeting the drone instead of a nearby manned spy plane.
The aircraft was manned and had around 35 crew members. Well, we could have targeted that plane. It was in our right to do so. And yes, it was American. But we didn't do it. We hit the unmanned aircraft.
The escalation has prompted fears of a full-blown war between Iran and the US.
To Iran, Donald Trump says if you are ready to accept our conditions, the door is open to an extraordinary relationship. But what will it take to de-escalate the tensions between both countries? A little earlier, France 24 spoke with Ali Vaez, a senior analyst for the International Crisis Group, and this is his take.
Look, in every crisis, there is an opportunity. And the reality is, I think both sides now realize that things are getting into dire straits and are becoming quite dicey. And in that, there is a possibility for mediation and for de-escalation. It would, however, require President Trump, I think, to step aside from the maximum pressure policy and decide to cash in on his leverage. And this would probably also require a change of guards. I don't think he would be able to engage in serious diplomacy with the Iranians with the cast of characters that have surrounded him at this moment and are hawkish and proponents of regime change. But I think the Iranians would not come to the negotiating table with a gun to their head, and President Trump would need to, first of all, tone down his rhetoric and his administration's rhetoric, make it clear to the Iranians that he's not seeking regime change, probably appoint an envoy for Iran who doesn't belong to Bolton-Pompeo camp, and finally, to provide Iranians with some sort of sanctions relief that would then encourage them and would justify the political price that they would have to pay at home in order to engage the Trump administration.
President Trump nominated Army Secretary Mark Esper to become the new Secretary of Defense after Patrick Shanahan resigned last Monday. He had taken over from James Mattis, who had resigned last December over differences in policies with the American president. Trump plans to nominate David Norquist, who currently serves as the Pentagon's controller and will become Deputy Defense Secretary. To Hong Kong, where the protesters have called for an investigation into alleged police brutality that marred demonstrations last week. Protests have continued as anger remains after the government put a halt to the extradition bill, but what they want is for the legislation to be scrapped entirely and for the city's chief executive to step down. Luke Schrager has this report.
A sea of protesters throughout central Hong Kong on Friday night, blocking the police headquarters. The island's government may have backed down over its extradition bill for now, but the protesters' anger has yet to dissipate.
These last few days, I've stayed here in the Admiralty District. We all know really well what happened. The Hong Kong government and the police have really offended the people of Hong Kong.
I've not come here to bring chaos. It's because of the government. The police are the ones acting like rioters.
Police cracked down hard during protests earlier in the month, sparking calls for an investigation into their behaviour and allegations of brutality. Demonstrators want detainees released, and the bill, which would have allowed for extraditions to mainland China, scrapped entirely. It's been seen as yet another move by Beijing to erode Hong Kong's freedoms. The island's been administered under a one country, two systems framework since it returned to Chinese rule in 1997. The protests are the largest in Hong Kong's history and sparked memories of pro-democracy demonstrations 5 years ago that lasted for 3 months, as another member of the government came out in contrition.
Being a team member of the government, I offer my sincere apology to all people of Hong Kong. We promise to adopt a most sincere and humble attitude to accept criticisms and make improvements in serving the public.
Another demand is for Hong Kong's leader Carrie Lam to step down. She's resisted such calls and has also apologised, though protesters seem unimpressed. They've vowed another mass demonstration on July the 1st.
The visit of a Russian lawmaker to Georgia's parliament created a wave of protests that turned violent in the capital, Tbilisi. On Thursday, police had to use tear gas and rubber bullets to stop crowds of people storming their way into the building. At least 240 people were injured in the crackdown that led the head of parliament to step down. Opposition leaders have called for snap elections. Tensions are running high between the two countries, especially since 2008, when the South Caucasus nation lost a short war against Moscow. Yuka Rai has the details.
Night falls and they're still out in their thousands. The Speaker of Georgia's parliament has stepped down, but the move has done little to calm protesters, angry at Russia and at their own government.
I'm standing here to save Georgian sovereignty, which is under threat. We will not surrender Russian occupation. We will not surrender Russian ideas.
Georgians crying foul of Russian occupation, more than a decade after the two countries fought a war over two breakaway Georgian regions. Following the 2008 conflict, Moscow recognized South Ossetia and Abkhazia as independent states. On Thursday, a Russian MP who backed their independence sat in the Speaker's chair of Georgia's parliament, addressing the audience in Russian.
This is an insult, and it was a red line where the society didn't tolerate government's actions.
Protesters and the opposition are demanding the Interior Minister step down over the police's crackdown on demonstrators, which left over 200 people wounded. The country's Prime Minister blamed the opposition for the violence, saying they hijacked public outrage. Russia, meanwhile, has decided to suspend Georgia-bound flights from July the 8th, citing national security concerns, while dismissing the current unrest as Georgia's internal conflict.
Well, following the outbreak of unrest in Georgia, Vladimir Putin has ordered the suspension of passenger flights from Russia to Georgia and is said to have also recommended travel agencies to suspend all tours to the neighbouring country. Spain's Supreme Court overruled a case that sparked outrage in 2017 when 5 men were handed down a 9-year prison sentence for a crime that was pointed out as sexual harassment. Today, these men, whose faces were plastered on banners during many national protests, are convicted for rape and will be jailed for 15 years. The 18-year-old girl was filmed being raped in a building's lobby by those men who boasted about the attack on social media. The men's lawyers said the woman was consented the act. The prosecutor had a whole other story. Take a listen.
The victim was in a situation where she was so scared she was stupefied and became submissive. It was submission, not consent. On this ground, and based on the evidence, we argue that what took place constituted a crime of rape because there was sufficient intimidation by the 5 accused, which allowed them to perform sexual acts on the victim.
Well, for more on the reaction on the streets of Madrid, here is our correspondent, Sarah Morris.
For many of the protesters, and some of them have come out tonight outside the Supreme Court saying that this is a patriarchal justice system. There are too many old-fashioned male judges who really don't get what these offences involve. But of course, this is a country which has pioneered some of the laws and the high, fast system of treating, for instance, domestic violence and violence against women. Now domestic violence here in Spain is called gender violence, and there's special courts that treat those cases. So the Spanish are still scratching their heads as to how this could have happened, why these judges, including one judge who did want to acquit these men, saying that he believed that it had been consensual. The Spanish government, the conservative that was in the time at the time of this verdict, and now the socialist, both backing a judicial review which is ongoing, and the Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez saying tonight that this is the proof that yes must mean yes, a no is a no, and that backs the review of the law that is going on.
That was Sarah Morris there reporting for us from Madrid. UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Michelle Bachelet is in Venezuela. She met with both Nicolas Maduro and opposition leader Juan Guaido. Her visit comes amid the country's ongoing economic and political crisis that has caused some 4 million Venezuelans to flee. The former Chilean president called for the release of the 715 political prisoners. Maduro said he would take seriously the recommendations she had to give. Take a listen.
You can count on me, Dr. Bachelet, as President of the Republic, head of state, and head of government, to take seriously your suggestions, your recommendations, and your proposals, so that in Venezuela, a human rights system prevails.
The Africa Cup of Nations kicked off in Egypt this Friday. The hosts were awarded the competition just 6 months ago. Authorities are confident they have the infrastructure in place to host the largest football contest on the continent. 24 teams will battle it out in 6 venues over the course of the next 4 weeks to try to clinch the title of Best African Football Team. Egypt won the opening match against Zimbabwe 1-0. AFP sports journalist Nicholas McAnally spoke to Delano de Souza, France 24, and gave us a little insight on the newbies of the competition.
It's going to have a lot of impact. A lot of players play in Europe where obviously it's not as hot, so it's going to be difficult for them to adjust to the heat and also the rhythm, because it's very intensive football, very intensive games with a lot of pressure from the fans. So they have to adjust to all those difficulties.
Now, we have a lot of new, smaller teams playing for this Africa Cup of Nations, Madagascar being one. Any surprises, dark horses, in your opinion?
It's African football. There's always going to be a surprise. I personally would put a little euro on probably Mauritania, because they have a very strong squad. They got a very good coach who is French, Corentin Martins. He has quite an experience as a coach, but the federation gave him time to organize everything, build a strong squad, and they could be a bit of a surprise.
And finally, the legendary British musician Elton John was awarded the Legion of Honor here in France. That is the one of the most rewarding awards to be given, handed over by the French president, who recognized Elton John's commitment to combat HIV and AIDS. France is hosting the 3rd fundraising conference for the Global Fund for AIDS, tuberculosis and malaria. Canada had hosted in 2016 and collected $12 billion. You're up to date with the latest. Stay tuned to France 24. More news coming up shortly.